Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician class, session number 15. During our previous session, we had a quick look at our curriculum progress. We mentioned our practice exams. Then we got into the technical topics of repeater stations, auxiliary stations, space stations, automatic stations. We discussed what are linked repeaters, also repeater offsets. We discussed what CTCSS was, also reverse function. We discussed over deviation. We talked about some operational topics such as making contacts, simplex operations, radio operations, how to conduct test transmissions. We also discussed what are Q signals, also the concept of band plans. We discussed emergency communications, what are nets or networks. Then we went into the phonetic alphabet, discussed message handling or formal traffic messages, then satellite operations, and we ended the technical topics with the concept of the Doppler shift. And we had our usual question pool review. So for this evening, our agenda is as follows. We'll have a quick look again at our curriculum progress. We'll mention practice exams. Then we go into our technical topics for this evening. Contesting, we'll discuss what's called grid locators. Then we go into radio direction finding and what is IRLP, VoIP, or voice over IP. We'll talk about Echolink, and that should be Echolink. Then DTMF, we'll discuss the concept of gateways. We talk a bit about the FCC rules, part 97. Then we'll also talk about frequency allocations, what are band plans, then some of the privileges that you get as a technician licensee. We'll talk a bit importance of selecting the transmit frequency. Then we differentiate between primary and secondary users, get straight into some licensing topics. Then we will end with the prohibited transmission or prohibited activities. And then we will do our usual question pool review. We'll mention the upcoming in-person exam in Trinidad and Tobago. And then we will set the date for our next session, which we expect to be our last session. Okay, so if we're to look at our screen and we see our curriculum, we see that we are on operating procedures, just a few more technical areas and that. We'll be finishing that up this evening and we'll get well into rules and regulations about halfway through. So really good progress, and we congratulate all participants for sticking with it so far and making all of this great progress. So again, a reminder of the practice exams. On your screen are the links. By now, you should have had a pretty good command of all of the topics or the majority of topics. So practice exams are within your reach, highly encouraged. Again, we are using the No Nonsense Technician Class License Study Guide, the latest edition. And again, we'll just repeat these couple of slides to show you what we're aiming at. At the end of the day, when we become licensed, hopefully we'll end up setting up an amateur radio station of some type. Maybe this one that's on your screen, an HF station. Or maybe this one, we'll have a mobile station. Or maybe this one, we'll have a handheld radio or two, all right? So this is what we are working towards, or some of what we are working towards. Becoming a licensed amateur radio operator, licensed to experiment, licensed to get access to spectrum. Right. So we talked about several things when we went through the purpose of amateur radio. We talked about emergency communications as being important. That's where amateur radio shines. But there's an area in amateur radio operations that's called contesting. So I wouldn't get into the slide that's on your screen. You can read it on your own time and see a bit more about what the concept of contesting is. But because it's on the exam, we will get to a couple of points in relation to contesting. So it is part of the hobby part, if you want to call it, of amateur radio, but it also allows you to get quite familiar with operating radio equipment, making contacts in rapid succession, efficient passing of messages, and talking with many amateur radio operators simultaneously in what you call a pileup, as well as, most importantly, operating under difficult band conditions when there's quite a bit of noise. So while this is part of the hobby aspect of amateur radio, we'll come to what exactly it is contesting. It is also something that, should you choose to engage in this part of amateur radio, it does help you become a better communicator. It gives you a lot of experience, and it also helps with being ready for emergency communication. So it's not just all having fun, it's also towards preparation and becoming better amateur radio operators. So let's talk about what exactly is contesting and what we need to know for the exam. So we have a definition of contesting. So on your screen, it's the operating activity that involves contacting as many stations as possible during a specific period, and that is called contesting. So there are many contests on air. You have different contests on different bands over different days with different modes and different reasons. Sometimes it's affiliated with some other activity. But contesting, you need to know this definition. Contacting as many stations as possible, meaning other amateur radio operators, during a specified period. So sometimes you have a contest for a couple of hours in a day. Maybe that could be a 24-hour period. It can also be even a 48-hour period. And so that's what they mean by during a specific period. Again, contacting as many stations as possible during a specific period. That's the definition of contesting. Okay. So in a contest, you have to contact other amateur radio operators. So you have to observe all of the procedures that we have talked about when you're making a contact. You have to utilize your call sign. You have to call sometimes CQ. All of those procedural things that we had discussed in previous sessions must maintain that good order. However, for contesting, we need to be aware that in contacting other stations, the communication is very short. So we say that the following is good procedure when contacting another station on a contest. That is, send only the minimum information needed for proper identification and the contest exchange. So brevity in communication in a contest. You're not going to have a long 5-minute, 10-minute conversation or what you call a rag chew or a long QSO, right? You're going to have a very brief contact and you send minimally what is required. And you have to send the identification, which is your call sign. And sometimes, because it's a contest, you have to keep a log. And one of the things that you may need to log is called an exchange or contest exchange. And that could be a serial number. So the first person you contact, you could tell them 1. The next person, you can tell them 2. Next person, you tell them 3. Or sometimes we'll come to the concept of a grid locator next. Sometimes that contest exchange is your grid locator. You have to give that to the other amateur radio operator. So just know it's a minimum exchange of information when you are contesting. It's not a long drawn out contact. Matter of fact, why it's short as well is because you're trying to make as many contacts as possible. So if you have a long conversation, you will not make as many. So this is an exam question. Good procedure in a contest is to send only the minimum information needed for proper identification, meaning call sign, and the contest exchange, which is dependent on the particular contest. Right, so we did mention that sometimes that contest exchange could be your grid locator, but what exactly is your grid locator? So some persons may know about GPS coordinates. You can give that. You can give a street address. Some persons may be familiar with the what 3 words. That's a website that you can go and get 3 words that accurately describes your location anywhere in the world within a 1 meter square, a 3 meter square area, right? You can get a pretty precise location using what 3 words. But in amateur radio, we tend to use what is known as a grid locator. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a world map, and you'll see that world is divided in grids, and you have them labeled here. So if we were to go, let's say Trinidad and Tobago, FK, Foxtrot Kilo, that is the first 2 letters, but you can get more precise and drill all the way down. So for example, on the bottom right-hand side of the screen here, we will see that Trinidad and Tobago is in the grid square known as Foxtrot Kilo 90, FK90. But you could drill down even further and get to another location, and you'll have Foxtrot Kilo 90. And let's say my location in Woodbrook is Foxtrot Kilo 90, Foxtrot Papa, FK90FP. And you can get even more granular than that. So it is a way of giving your location instead of giving an address, a street address, and so on. It's a very quick way, very efficient way. Just imagine giving 4 letters or 2 letters and 2 numbers, or 2 letters, 2 numbers, and 2 letters again. And you have a pretty precise GPS location, latitude, longitude. That might be hard to always call that out, north latitude, west latitude, and digits and so on, depending on the GPS longitude, latitude format that you use. But with a grid square, it's pretty easy and quick to give a precise location. And amateur radio operators utilize the grid square. So you need to learn the definition of a grid locator or grid square for the exam. So a grid locator is a letter number designator assigned to a geographic location. So let's dissect that. Grid locator, letter number designator. So Foxtrot Kilo 90, that's a letter number designator. So of course we can get even more granular. So you can get letter number and then some more letters as well to get more granular for greater precision. But for the exam, what we need to know is what a grid locator is defined as. It's a letter number designator, and it's assigned to a geographic location. It's very unique. Once you have those letter number combination, it points to a particular spot on Earth. So it's like the GPS for amateur radio. So of course, amateur radio operators also do use GPS, but grid locator or the grid square is something that is used when you're given your location in amateur radio. It's used in contests also. All right, so let's now discuss RDF, or radio direction finding. What is that? So it's one of the techniques. It's a sport, sometimes in a way, sometimes it's called the fox hunt, where you could try to locate a transmitter or the source of interference using radio direction finding techniques. It requires the use of a particular antenna and a directional antenna that requires a receiver, and sometimes that receiver will need to have a signal strength meter. So when you point that antenna, so this guy here is in a field, he has a Yagi antenna, it's horizontally polarized, and of course he has some sort of transmitter he's listening to. Hopefully that transmitter has a gauge, maybe an analog or a digital gauge to show signal strength. And he's moving it around, pointing it in different directions to try to get the greatest signal. And he can triangulate as well, or he could walk towards the direction of the greatest signal. And you can locate that transmitter. So that's why it's sometimes called fox hunting. And there can be fox hunts or fox hunting competitions. And it's also helpful, apart from just trying to locate a transmitter that someone puts for you to find. If you have interference, noise, you can also use that technique to identify the source of interference. You can chase it down, find the location of that interference. But it's very helpful to have a directional antenna like this one that this guy is using here. Because remember what a directional antenna does? It transmits and receives strongly in a particular direction, and that's what you want it to do, receive strongly and reject in other directions. Off to the side and to the back, you want it to reject. So when you point it and you see a signal strength increase on the meter for the radio, you hear the noise or the transmission sound louder, you know that you're pointing the antenna generally perhaps in the direction that it's coming from. So there are a couple of points we need to learn for the exam. That radio direction finding is a method used to locate sources of noise interference or jamming. Also, we need to know that a directional antenna is an item that would be useful for a hidden transmitter hunt, or what we call a fox hunt. How that works is hams will get together and say, let's have a fox hunt. Someone will create a beacon or a little transmitter and hide it somewhere and don't tell anyone and say, okay, find it. And hams will have to use their receiver, antenna combination and skill to locate that transmitter using radio direction finding techniques. So a directional antenna like this one, a Yagi, it's very helpful in fox hunting. All right, Let's now talk about a mode that's called IRLP, or technology or technique or system or network called IRLP. So what is it? It stands for Internet Radio Linking Project, and the name should give away a little bit about what it does. So we'll come to a diagram, a block diagram that shows the architecture of that network called the Internet Radio Linking Project, or IRLP. But what it really is that, sometimes as hams, we can use simplex transmissions. We can do radio to radio using one particular frequency. Our quote unquote range might be relatively limited, especially depending on the band that we're using. Maybe it's VHF, UHF, and we are limited by range, simplex, or we may then decide to extend, prove our coverage and use a repeater to have a wider area coverage. But then we may want to link our repeaters together to even have a even wider coverage where we can talk to other radio operators, even in a global scale. And that's exactly what IRLP does. It will use the internet and connect repeater systems together, and you can use your radio. And whereas normally you would be limited to another radio operator within your vicinity, within your country or territory, you can talk halfway around the world, because these repeaters are linked over the internet or using voice over IP technologies. And for the exam, we need to know what the IRLP is, or Internet Radio Linking Project. It is a technique to connect amateur radio systems, such as repeaters, via the internet using voice over internet protocol. So this is just a succinct version of what we just mentioned, that the IRLP is, and you have a little bit of a longer explanation as to what IRLP is. In yellow, again, the technique we've been using almost always, once you see a bullet point in yellow, it is an exam question, verbatim. So here's a little block diagram to show the architecture, the network diagram of IRLP. You will have a repeater at one location. It can be in one country, and you have a repeater that's located. It can be in another country. It can be in the same country, but again, we're showing the power of extending that range and coverage using repeaters. So it can be in one. So let's say this repeater is located in Trinidad and Tobago. This other one may be located in Dominica, or it may be located in the United States, or it may be located in India, anywhere really around the world, because you are going to connect it to the internet, and the internet is an interconnected network of networks. So we connected via the internet. And what the repeater will do, it will send information across the internet to the other repeater, and those stations will receive those transmissions. And when they transmit, the repeater will receive it. Of course, it will rebroadcast locally, as we have shown what repeaters do, right? Several kilometers or several miles will be covered in that country or that territory. But it goes over the internet also and goes to another repeater in another country, and you have a coverage of several kilometers or miles where operators can speak as well. So that's what the IRLP does. It links repeaters together using the internet to have a much wider area coverage of communication. So we did say that IRLP uses VoIP or VoIP. But what exactly is VoIP? Voice over Internet Protocol. That is what it stands for. And it's a technology that's been developed for many years. It's used for many purposes, commercial and otherwise. But of course, hams, we utilize any and every means necessary that's legal to communicate as well. So VoIP or VoIP is used in some of these technologies, such as IRLP, and another one we'll come to as well, which is Echolink. And there's another one called All-Star Link. And there are many other forms of linking amateur radio repeaters and transmitters together using voice over IP or voice over internet protocol. But we need to learn a definition for VoIP or VoIP for our exam, and that's what the bullet point at your bottom is saying here is voice over internet protocol, or VoIP is a method of delivering voice communications over the internet using digital techniques. What that says is that we are communicating using voice. That means we are speaking, or we call phone mode in amateur radio, and it uses the ubiquitous internet using digital techniques. So it's converting our analog voice, it's digitizing it, and sending it over IP or TCP/IP packets using this technique called voice over internet protocol. And this is a definition we need to learn for our exam. All right. So we now we talked a bit about IRLP, of linking repeaters together. We mentioned All Stars as another one, and we did talk about Echolink. But what is Echolink? And we need to learn what Echolink is for the exam. So similarly to IRLP, where you can link repeaters together, so we would know what repeaters are and we can link them together, you can use Echolink. Except that whereas IRLP requires you to use a radio typically, Echolink, you can use, you don't necessarily have to use a radio per se, right? It's typical to use a computer or smartphone and get onto an internet connection and speak voice over IP to other users who are also speaking voice over IP, or it can be interfaced and interlinked to actual repeaters running radio frequency or RF nodes, similar to IRLP. But with Echolink, you can sometimes not even use a radio, the traditional radio, handheld radio, mobile radio, base radio. You can be using an app that's on a phone, an iPhone or an Android phone or a tablet or even a PC. So Echolink is software that you can install on your phone, computer, and turn that into essentially a radio, but it's not technically a radio that you're using. So it's called the Echolink system. But there are a couple of things that you need to know about Echolink to use it. And the first bullet point in yellow is, before using the Echolink system, a requirement is that you need to register your call sign with the Echolink system and provide proof of license. So Echolink is for use only by licensed amateur radio operators, and you got to prove that you have a license for your call sign to be accepted and used on Echolink. So you have to register. We also need to know that, as mentioned, the Echolink protocol allows an amateur station to transmit through a repeater without using a radio to initiate the transmission. So remember, we said we can use, let's break that down. Let's dissect what that's saying to us here. We said that we can use a phone, a mobile phone, or a tablet, or a PC, and not use a radio at all. And we are actually talking to other amateurs that are doing the same thing, or other amateurs that actually are using radio equipment. So that's all this bullet point is saying here, that you don't have to use a radio. You can use something else, right? The protocol allows you to get onto Echolink without using a radio. You could be using a phone, a mobile device, a tablet, a computer, and your transmission could be going through a repeater, but you yourself are not using an actual radio. So when you become licensed, one of the things you can do is quickly sign up on Echolink once you have a valid call sign, get registered, and bam, you are on air because you are using a piece of software on a phone or a computer, and your voice is going over the internet, and it may end up on a node that is connected to a repeater, and your voice is being heard on RF, and you're not yourself using a radio. So many amateur radio operators, as soon as you get your license, you go onto Echolink and you can use your call sign and speak people around the world, around the globe, or in your local territory, your local country as well. So be sure, think about Echolink. As soon as you get your license, consider signing up for it. And you can get on the air, so to speak, right away. All right, check it out. So here, of course, we have a little diagram showing you how Echolink is set up, a little network diagram. Similar to IRLP, you see we use the internet, we have the repeaters, but we can also use PC client software and mobile client software. And on the right-hand side, we have, let's say, the app. On the right-hand side here, this is an iPhone or an Android device that you see the Echolink app, and you have the transmit button or the push to talk here. So it's an app, and you may say, well, wait a minute, is that really radio? Well, also all fair, fair game, right? We're using an app, voice over IP, and on the below here, you're seeing the Windows version of the Echolink client software. You can use your microphone on your PC and your speakers and utilize the software to communicate. And you'll notice the call signs of the stations. You'll see the different countries. You can click on the different countries and see the repeaters or the users or the linked devices in there, and you can connect and make a call. So all from just software, but you must have a valid license. If you don't have an amateur radio license, you will not be able to use it. It will be illegal to do so. So again, that amateur radio license is really a ticket. Okay, let's continue. DTMF. So many of us know about DTMF, but we may not have thought about what DTMF is until maybe today. If you have a mobile phone, whether it's Android or an iPhone or any platform, and you have dialed a number, you have used DTMF. If you have used a keypad to open a door, you have used DTMF. If you have used the earlier phones, the push button phones as well, landline phones, you have used DTMF. If you use a PBX connected phone, whether it's IP phone or regular TDMA analog phone, any type of phone, and you have pressed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you want to dial a number 800 link or something like that, you are using DTMF. But what is DTMF? It means dual tone multi-frequency. You may have noticed when you press one of these digits on your phone or some other thing else, you'll hear a tone beep, and you press the other one and you hear a beep, and you may notice that the beeps actually may sound differently, right, depending on the device that you're using. So you must try that. If you have a phone device, pick it up, when you get a chance, and press it and convince yourself that the tone sounds differently. And why it sounds different is because the combination of frequencies are different when you press one digit. Press number 1, you have a combination of this frequency and this frequency. When you press the number 3, you have a combination of this frequency and this frequency. When you press the number 9, you have a combination of this frequency and this frequency. So it's where the two frequencies intersect. So you have these 4 frequencies on top, these 4 frequencies to the side. And depending on the number or digit that you press, it will combine these 2 frequencies to give a unique frequency. And that is what is called DTMF, dual tone. So it has 2 tones that is used, and it's multi-frequency. So that's what DTMF, essentially, the tones that you get when you press the number on the keypad. Now it is in fact used in amateur radio, because notice this ham transceiver here. This is a dual band VHF UHF transceiver, and you may notice there's a keypad there. There's a keypad on the radio itself, and the external microphone, there's also a keypad. And if you want to use something like IRLP and you want to connect your repeater to another repeater or another station, you can key in and punch in a specific combination of digits or numbers or even the letter interpretation of it and instruct the repeater to connect to another repeater. Yes, you press the push to talk, and then you press the combination, whatever it is, to tell and instruct the repeater to make a connection. So that's where DTMF comes in. So we need to know for the exam that over-the-air access to IRLP nodes is accomplished by using DTMF signals. So if you want to use your radio and use IRLP, you have to use these numbers, digits on your keypad to instruct the IRLP node to connect and disconnect and so on. So it's an exam question. And another thing that you need to be aware of is that DTMF, which is dual tone multi-frequency, is a type of signaling. So you're signaling, you're sending a signal that uses what? Pairs of audio tones. And we have on the right-hand side here, to make it real, we actually show you what those actual tones are. So when you press any of these digits, so if you press the number 6, it combines 770 Hertz with 1477 Hertz. That's what it means. So it's 2 audio tones that are combined to give 1. So that's what DTMF is, and this is the exam question. This is what you'll get, so please learn it. All right, let's just do a couple more slides before we take our break. So of course, as amateur radio operators, we talked about the fact that we can use Echolink, All-Starlink, and also IRLP as ways to link our computers together, our radio systems together, repeaters together, and we can all communicate kumbaya around the world using these voice over IP techniques. But we need to know that in a network such as this, on this right-hand side here, we have, we introduced you to D-Star previously, the mode called D-Star. This is a little snippet from a D-Star network, and you'll see you have repeaters that are linked to each other. You'll have users that will have a radio, and you'll notice that we are linking voice over IP over the internet again to go or extend our range to maybe a different country, right, around the world. And we need to know that that device that interfaces us between our amateur radio station or the repeater and the internet, because there's something that has to interface between the two, or connect or bridge between our RF system, our repeater or radio station and the internet. That device is called a gateway. So we need to know for the exam the definition of what a gateway is, and we have that here as the bullet point. A gateway is an amateur radio station that connects other amateur stations to the internet. It's as simple as that. And that's why it's called a gateway. It's the internet gateway. It sends the signal from the radio frequency system onto the internet to go to another repeater or another user. And it also does the opposite. It takes it off the internet and sends it to your local repeater or RF system. That device is called a gateway. So we need to have rules and regulations that govern amateur radio. And of course, we are doing US exams. So just bear that in mind. We are always talking from the perspective of the United States in our course. So just localize for your situation. So for the exam, we need to know about the FCC. We have talked about the FCC before. But the FCC is the agency that regulates and enforces the rules for amateur radio in the US. So this is an exam question here. Let's go it over again. The FCC is the agency that regulates and enforces the rules for the amateur radio service in the United States. Right? So they're the organization. They are the authority for communications. It's called the FCC. In case you wanted to know what FCC meant, it's the Federal Communications Commission. Right? And this is an exam question. So we also need to be aware of the purpose of amateur radio. So we did very early in the course, we gave some definitions of what amateur radio is. We talked about the amateur radio service. I think we even talked about the amateur radio satellite service. So we gave some definitions. But for the exam, we need to be aware that there's a particular purpose, or there's one of the basis and purpose of the amateur radio service. That is advancing skills in the technical and communications phases of the radio art. Right? So remember we said amateur radio is about experimenting, learning the techniques, getting into the technical aspects, experimenting. So that's kind of what they mean here in this little techno jumbo. Advancing skills in the technical and communications phases of the radio art is part of the basis and purpose of the amateur radio service. So I'll come on a slide just now that shows you that section from this document called Part 97. Every participant was sent this document via email. If you don't have it, you can check the link where we have all of the documents, including the slides and all of the handouts and all of the text that we provided. This is also a document in your compendium, and you can have a look at it because it governs everything. And we encourage persons to please consider reading through. This is the Part 97 FCC rules. So under a section called Basis and Purpose of the Amateur Radio Service, it has this point that talks about advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. And we'll come to a slide, hopefully that will convince you of that. Right, so we have just excerpted. This is not generally on your exam and you don't need to learn this. However, it's extra information and it's very useful to know if you're getting into amateur radio. What's the purpose of amateur radio? But we wouldn't get into every single bullet point here. We'd encourage you to please consider reading it. It's important information, but this is really just to convince you the bullet point before that's in your exam, advancing skills in both the communication and technical phases of the art. This is just to convince you that that point is under the basis and purpose section of Part 97. Right? So this is an extract from the rules and regulations, and it is showing you where it is extracted from. We try to do that as fast as possible throughout the course to show you the source of a lot of these exam questions. Where are they coming from? What's the authoritative document that's being used to develop these exam questions? All right. So let's probably just push through with one or two more slides before our break. So we are talking about Part 97. That's the rules. That's the regulation and the FCC rules, yes? So there are a couple of definitions inside of there in addition to what we already talked about. We already discussed what a beacon is. We showed you what it can be, and especially in the context of satellite beacons. But there are different types of beacons. And a beacon is just a station that is transmitting. It can be periodic, and it's for determining things like how is your radio wave propagating across free space. Can I hear a station that is located in this country? So if there's a beacon in a country like Ireland, for example, and I'm hearing the beacon transmitting, that means I can probably communicate with someone in Ireland. So that's the purpose of a beacon. On our right-hand side here, we have a picture of an actual beacon station, pretty sophisticated one of that, a lot of equipment inside of there. And this is just set up to be a beacon to transmit periodically. So For the exam, we need to know that Part 97 definition of a beacon is an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. So it's just a station that is transmitting. It may be CW it's transmitting, or you may hear the tones of the Morse code tone of the station identifier, because it's got to identify itself as well. So when you listen to that beacon, it may be in the form of Morse code. It could be some other form. It could be a digital mode as well. But the point is, this beacon is transmitting. I need to know this definition from the FCC Part 97. What is a beacon? Also need to know the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station. So we dealt with space stations before, and we actually did have a participant asking a little bit more information. So here's a little bit more information about what a space station is. It's defined as an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. So that, for example, is the ISS. The ISS, the International Space Station, will be considered a space station. So you have the Earth, you have the clouds and the oceans and so on, and there's a space station that is rapidly, transiting across an orbit around the Earth, right? So there it is. It is a space station. And you need to know and learn the definition of a space station according to FCC Part 97. 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. Also, we need to learn about the concept of interference and whether or not we allowed interference or not, right? So we have a definition here of what harmful interference is, but we need to know for the exam that at no time is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted. That's why we do training. That's why we do exams. That's why we try to become educated about amateur radio practice, best practice. All of us, when we produce ourselves as amateur radio operators, we go, we study, we sit the exam. When we come out, much is expected of us. We must operate in a certain kind of way. Too much is given, much is expected. There's a heavy responsibility. And once we become licensed, we have passed those exams, it is expected that we know about interference. We know that we should not cause interference, especially willful interference, right? So that is also why we talk quite a bit about noise and interference and the solutions, and being conservative and being cooperative and being compassionate and caring, and of course being courteous. So we need to learn this for the exam, that at no time is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted. Right. All right, so let's just do this final slide before our break. So again, according to Part 97 rules, we need to know what it says about repeater and auxiliary station frequency assignments. So remember, we did talk about what a repeater is. We talked about a repeater having two frequencies, a transmit and a receive. And we also talked about an auxiliary station, things like crossband repeat. But how do you go about selecting a frequency? How do you just punch in a frequency on a repeater and just set it up and let it go? Well, you may cause interference with another station who might have simply selected the same frequency if there were no some sort of coordination. So there's something called volunteer frequency coordinator, who is, well, this should be recognized, sorry for the typo, recognized by local amateurs, that entity will recommend transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations. So sorry about the typos, folks. We'll fix it when we circulate the slide deck. Okay. So we need to know about the volunteer frequency coordinator. That person coordinates the frequency assignment, right? So you just don't go and just set up a repeater and put it up on any old frequency that you want. You want to talk with the volunteer frequency coordinator to make sure that the frequency that you put up on your repeater is coordinated. So we have a couple pictures on the right hand side here. So we did show previously the inside of what a repeater station looks like. Here's another picture. So you have your transmitter, receiver, or transceiver. You have a battery, power supply. You have the cavities, or some people call them the canisters, really the duplexers, or it could be combiners as well. But essentially to use one antenna to receive and transmit, or to combine multiple transmitters into one, so that you'll use one antenna to transmit or even to receive, right? So those are the cavities or the canisters, or filters as sometimes they're called. or duplexers, even combiners. So you have your repeater station, and this is what an antenna on a repeater station might look like. So this is a very nice 20-foot antenna. Some people call them station masters, right? The old Motorola name, proprietary. And this is often a standoff at a high location on a mountain and it's overlooking a bay and overlooking the city or whatever area it is. So repeaters tend to be high up. That's the antenna. And when you put the repeater station up, you want to make sure your frequency is coordinated so you don't cause interference with another repeater. You don't want to be the input. You don't want your output of your repeater to be the input of another repeater. At least not by these, if it's not designed that way, right? So you have your volunteer frequency coordinator. So also for the exam, similar point, amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations can select the frequency coordinator. So that volunteer position, we get together and say, hey, we'd like you to be our coordinator for our district or area or country or whatever geographical territory that you're operating within. You all hams get together and essentially elect and say, hey, this person will be the one to coordinate those frequencies, right? So these are exam questions about the frequency coordinator or the volunteer frequency coordinator person. All right, so now is a good time to take a 2-minute break. Let's get up, take a little stretch, maybe have some water, bathroom break, and then we'll come right back in about 2 minutes time. All right. So, good evening, Adish. Always great to have you. Mark, good evening. All right. So, question here: technician, general tests, taking both at the same time, and are they two separate tests back to back, or is the general inclusive of technician? Okay, excellent question. So they are separate tests. With the volunteer examiners, you can make arrangement to sit the technician, and once you have passed, you can take the general. And once you have passed, you can even go on to take the extra, right? So that is often the case with the in-person exams. Remotely proctored exams, or what we may want to call online exams, you'll have to double check that the volunteer examiners are up to have multiple at the same time, right? But certainly the in-person, quite often, you do one, pass it, do the other one, pass it, and so you go, right? Even if you're not necessarily prepared, nothing wrong with trying it, because again, the V's, normally it's one fee to take the three, if you wanted to take all three in one sitting. That is entirely possible. So Mark, I hope I've answered your question. They are separate exams, so you have to take the technician, and then you take the general afterwards. Two separate exams, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's see if we can quickly restart so that we can cover our material this evening and not keep everyone too long. All right. So again, this is our repeater station, right? Some nice pictures of them, and a reminder that there's a position called the volunteer frequency coordinator who can help in coordinating the frequency assignments to repeater stations as well as auxiliary stations. And who decides who that volunteer frequency coordinator is? Well, we do, the amateur radios in the community. All right, so this trustee table should look quite familiar. So we're going to use it again. This formula on top here hopefully should look quite familiar as well. So we're putting them around and to remind ourselves, very useful references. But there's some exam questions that we need to learn, and hopefully these trustee tables and the formula here will help us remember these exam questions. So the first one is, they will ask you, what is an example of a frequency in the 6 meter band, right? And you will get 4 choices in the exam. Now, the correct answer will be 52.525 from the choices, the 4 choices. But how do you know what frequency is in a 6 meter band, right? So you can utilize this table, but you will not have this table in your exam. You could try to memorize. We see here the 6 meter band is the frequency range of 50 to 54 megahertz, 50 to 54 megahertz. That's what the 6 meter band is. So that's why this answer, 52.525, is between 50 and 54. So this will be a correct answer. The other answers will not be a frequency between 50 and 54 megahertz, right? It will not be in the 6 meter band. When we come to the question pool, you'll see the other distracted answers, which are wrong, the wrong answers. But what if you cannot remember what frequency range is in the 6 meter band? This is where this trustee formula that can be utilized comes in. Lambda wavelength is equal to 300 over frequency. And you can also use algebraic manipulation and put the F up here and put the lambda down here and get frequency is equal to 300 over the wavelength, right? So you can interchange these two to have the two formats. So this is what I would do. If I cannot remember what frequency is 6 meters, what I do is divide 300 by 6 and I will get the answer. All right. So just remember this formula here. Anytime you have a frequency and you want to convert what meter band it is, or you have a meter band and you want to convert it to what frequency, you can use this formula. It works. All you need it to be is approximately correct, the answer, and you will get the answer, right? So remember this formula and you'll be good with any frequency to band conversion. But this is one of the exams, one of the questions you get in the exam. Which one of the 4 is in the 6 meter band. The correct answer will be the one that is between 50 and 54 megahertz. So 52.525 will be correct because it lies between the range of the 6 meter band, which is 50 to 54 megahertz. That's the frequency. Another question in the opposite direction. They'll give you a frequency and I'll ask you what band is it. So they ask you about the amateur band that includes 146.520 megahertz. We just have for your information that happens to be the national calling frequency. Is that the 10 meter band, the 80 meter band, the 2 meter band, the 6 meter band? How do we know? So again, we can use our trusty formula and divide 300 by 146. So we could even round it up and say 146 is approximately 50, right? 150. So we could divide 300 by the approximate, round it up to 150. 300 divided by 150 is 2. So you see how we get the 2 meter band here? But the 2 meter band is between 144 and 148 megahertz. So that's why 146.520 is between 144 and 148. So that is how the answer is the 2 meter band. It would not be the 6 meter band or the 10 meter band or the 80 meter band. The correct answer for this question will be the 2 meter band. But if you can remember this little trusty formula and you forgot what is 146 in terms of the band again, you just divide it into 300 and you will get the answer. You'll get something close to 2 and it's like, oh, okay. So even if you get 1.9 something, but even if you get 2.1 something, whatever you choose to divide, you will know it's approximately 2. So there you go. So try to remember this. Find it to be helpful, and many students in the past have found this to be extremely helpful. Sometimes it's tough to remember all of these. The more experience that you get as an amateur radio operator, it will come, you'll remember it, all right, over time. All right, so let's talk about band plans. So we did allude to band plans before, but now we are going a little more deeper into band plans. We'll be pulling out specific bands from the band plan and dissecting them quite a bit. So we did show the slide before, the US band plan. Right, here it is again, and we'll be utilizing this one on the right hand side, and we'll be zooming in and pulling out different bands. So you have the 40 meter band, and you have the 80 meter band, and you have the 160 meter band, you have the 6 meter band, you have the 2 meter band, all on your band plan. And also you have some color schemes to show the modes, and then you have some letters to show the class of amateur radio operator that can use the frequencies and so on. So very good summary chart. But we will zoom on in like this and come down to a band. So 80 meter band, and we'll see what the extra class can do. We'll see what the general class can do, and we'll see what the technician can do. We'll also see what the other grandfathered classes, advanced and novice. So we don't talk about that now because you cannot go now and sit the exam to get an advanced class or a novice exam. Those were the grandfathered classes. They still exist, but you cannot now sit an exam for them. The exams you can sit is for technician, general, and extra. But the advanced class and the novice class still exists, and they have privileges as well. So that's why you'll find in the band plan, you'll be seeing EAGNT, extra, advanced class, general, novice, and technician. That's what it means. And you'll see it here in a zoomed in version of what's the section of the band plan. So it's a lot in the band plan, but we'll try to dissect it for you. All right, so for the exam, we need to know that a technician class operator does have voice privileges in the HF band, but it's only on the 10 meter band. So the technician class operator has very little or not much voice privileges on HF. Technician class has voice privileges on the VHF and up, so VHF, UHF, and so on, right? But in the HF band, remember, that's why we need to know what is HF and what is VHF and what is UHF, right? So the HF spectrum, the HF band, all of this, right? There's only one little area of this whole piece of HF spectrum that a technician class operator has voice privileges, meaning that you can speak, or phone privileges, or use single sideband. And that's on the 10 meter band only, and that's an exam question. The HF band that a technician class operator has phone privileges. Remember, anytime we talk phone in amateur radio, that's voice, that's speaking. Phone privileges is the 10 meter band only. So we have pulled out from the band plan, we have extracted it, zoomed it out, and show the 10 meter band that the technician has access to, You can do voice or single sideband in a very small section of the 10-meter band. Right? You do not have voice in any other part of the HF spectrum. You do have the ability to do CW or Morse code in several. So this section, this actually shows you here the HF privileges that a technician class operator has. They do have HF privileges on 80 meter, 40 meter, 50 meter. But if you want voice privileges on those bands, you need to at least get to the general class level. That's why it's an incentive to become a general class operator. You get voice, the ability to speak on many more bands in the HF part of the spectrum. And if you get extra, you get all the privileges, full spectrum. So technician class, with a voice, yes, but on the 10-meter band only. Also, we need to learn for the exam that frequency range that the technician class operator has access to is between 28.300 and 28.500 megahertz. So it's actually here on your screen. You can see it here. And that's the exam question. The frequency ranges available for phone. Remember, phone is voice, speaking. Operation by technician licensees is 28.300 to 28.500. And here in the band plan, it shows it 28.300, 28.500. And the mode, of course, voice mode will be single sideband. All right, let's continue. So there's another band called the 1.25 meter band. What is the, sorry, we're dealing with the 6 meter band. So, or 6 meter band and above. So we need to learn for the exam that the SSB phone, which is voice, may be used in amateur bands above 6 meters or 50 megahertz in at least some segment of all of these bands. So what that is really saying is that all of the bands above 6 meters, you can do voice in some part of the segments. That is what that is saying. You can speak, because there are some bands in the HF spectrum that you cannot use voice, or you cannot speak, and depending on your class of license. So this is a point that is telling you that anything above 6 meters, and we kind of put it here on this trusty table that we have here for you. So anything above 6 meters is here, go forward. So 6 meters, 2 meters, 1.25 meters, 70 centimeters, 33 centimeters, 23 centimeters, and so on, which is VHF and UHF and above. So 6 meters and above is this here. Anything below 6 meters, you may not necessarily have voice privileges. But what they're trying to tell you here, from here onwards, you will be able to do voice or SSB phone in these, on these bands. Right? That's simply what this bullet point is trying to tell you here. So we have illustrated that here with this arrow. You can do SSB voice. Also for the exam, we need to know that on the UHF, VHF, or the VHF, UHF band segment. So again, that's why this trusty table is useful. What do they mean by VHF, UHF band segments? So this is VHF here. This section is VHF. And this section is UHF. So they're telling us about the VHF, UHF band segments. So all of this, right? They're saying that the following are limited to CW only, right? So 50 megahertz to 50.1 megahertz. 144.0 megahertz to 144.1. Between those sections of the bands, you're only able to do Morse code or CW. So again, we have pulled it out from the band plan to show you that. So this is the 6 meter band, which is 50 megahertz, right? So 50.1, 50 to 50.1 megahertz. You notice this little symbol here? Well, that according to this legend here means CW only. So that is why this bullet point is correct. So you can do CW only. Anytime you see this squiggly line on the band plan, that is CW or Morse code only. And you'll see for the 6 meter band, between this frequency and this frequency, 50.0 to 50.1, which is what this bullet point is saying here, 50.0 to 50.1 megahertz, you can do CW. Let's go now to the 2 meter band, or the 144 megahertz band. So between 144.0 megahertz and 144.1 megahertz, what do you notice here? I have this little sine wave squiggly there. And what that means, according to Legend, it means you can do CW only, not RTTY, not voice, not data, not USB, not anything else. You can only do Morse code or CW. And that's what they mean by putting this symbol here for the 2 meter band, 144.0 to 144.1. This is a little segment of the 2 meter band. You can do CW only. Notice the rest of the band that is in blue. What does this mean? Well, you can do any other type. You can do phone, which is voice. You can do image, which is picture. You can do data modes. You can do RTTY, radio teletype. So that's what blue means. You can do all sorts of modes here. But this little section here, CW only. And that's what this bullet point is trying to tell us. You're limited to CW only on these frequency ranges. Exam question. Right, now we now come to the 1.25 meter band. What is the 1.25 meter band, right? So we have 1.25 meters, and we need to know for the exam that there's a limitation in part of that band between 219 and 220 megahertz. You are limited to doing fixed digital message forwarding systems only. So you need to learn this for the exam, and this is supported by the band plan. If you were to look at the band plan here, when we zoom on in, notice this color, this orange here, means fixed digital message forwarding systems only. So part of the 2 meter band, now the 2 meter band is actually from, it's not just this frequency range, right? But for this part of the 1.25 meter band, 219 to 220, you can only do fixed digital message forwarding only. You cannot do anything else in this range. You cannot do voice or SSB or anything else, right? So it's an exam question. It's a limitation. And when they talk about emission, they mean transmission or radio frequency, right? So they use different terms to try to tie us up. Or they use the technically correct term. It's an emission, right? On frequencies between 219 and 220, you need to learn that it's fixed digital message forwarding systems only. All right. All right, so this is a very important slide, folks. Very, very important. As a licensed amateur radio operator, when you're given frequency allocation, so you have this table and you are a general class operator or an extra class operator, and they tell you have all of these CHF privileges and VHF and UHF. If you're a technician, they'll tell you, well, you have VHF and above, and you have a little Morse code here, a little voice here inside of the HF spectrum. Not much, a little bit. But you need to respect the frequency allocation that you have been given as a ham. You cannot go below or above at all, right? You'll be out of band, you'll be out of order, and you'll be operating illegally. So when we are using our radio and we are punching in or dialing a frequency using either a keypad or a trusty tuning knob, we need to make sure that we are aware where our transmission is going. So while we may have on our display a frequency like 50.125 megahertz or 14.00 megahertz, whatever we punch into the display, we need to recognize that that is the position of the center of the frequency. But remember, when we do single sideband or some of the other modes, the frequency goes above and below what is displayed here. And if it's single sideband, it might go only above or only below. But we need to be conscious of when we are punching in a frequency that we do not punch in a frequency at the edge of the band, because the direct edge of the band. So for example, you don't want to punch in a frequency 14.000. So what we have here, you do not want to punch that frequency in, because if you, for these reasons that we'll come to in a little while, it can cause you to operate outside or below 14.00, because your transmission, the signal, the mode that you're using may cause you to be out of band. So as a responsible amateur radio operator, you need to be aware when you're punching in a frequency that you do not inadvertently, accidentally transmit out of your frequency privileges. So we need to learn the following bullet points for the exam. When setting your transmit frequency on your radio, that is, it is important to ensure, one, that you do not set it to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband, right? So let's say this subband, the 20 meter band, is from 14.00 to 14.35. you do not punch in 14.00 on your dial, right? You need to be above that. And you also don't want to punch in exactly 14.350. You want to be below that, because if you punch in exactly in 14.35 and you use upper sideband, you'll be above. Part of your transmission will go above, and that is illegal. That's improper, highly irresponsible at best, you know. And the reasons are to allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display. What if your frequency display is off by a little bit? You might say, you know, it's like a speedometer. If you're driving and you say, hey, I'm only driving at 100 kilometers per hour or 80 miles per hour. What if that speedometer is not properly calibrated? It is saying I'm doing 100 kilometers per hour, but if I use Waze or I use a GPS, it might tell me I'm actually traveling at 102 kilometers per hour, which is above the speed limit. And if I go much above that, I may actually be opening myself up to a charge, a citation. I might be ticketed. But my speedometer is saying, yeah, I'm only doing 100 kilometers. It's not properly calibrated, and that's the point here. So to allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display, which is this, if it's off by a little bit, do not select the exact edge of a band. Any of these frequencies at the top or the below, try not to use them at all, because you might transmit out of band if your instrument or your display is not properly calibrated. Another reason is that if you transmit, the sidebands may cause you to extend beyond the edge of your band, right? So you don't want to go beyond any of these band edges here, at the top or the below or the bottom, right? You want to stay in your lane. You don't want to go off, right? So do not select the exact edge of the band. Also, sometimes over a period, your oscillators, your transmitter may have frequency drift. So even though your display is showing one frequency, 50.125, it might not be that, because the accuracy has gone off, because the oscillator or something is drifting. And that happens, right? Things are not as accurate as we like to think that they are. So cater for that possibility. And that's why becoming a trained amateur radio operator is so important. You become very discerning. You become very knowledgeable. You know what to do, what not to do, what not to do. Make sure that you do not cause harmful interference, that you do not shoot yourself in the proverbial foot, right? So that's why we are being trained to learn these techniques, to learn these tips, so we do not inadvertently act irresponsibly by saying, well, I didn't know that my frequency could have drifted. No, you're learning technical information to know it's possible, so that you will operate very professionally with good integrity and good radio operating practices. Right. Let's talk now about the FAT, the frequency allocation table, right? And the fact that in our frequency allocation table, we have the concept of primary users and secondary users. But what is a primary user and what is a secondary user? So a primary user has rights to use the frequency spectrum without getting interference. A secondary user is a user who could use it, but if the primary user comes up to use it, must give way. Right? He's like, okay, all right, the primary user is here, I need to step aside, right? Let the primary user use, right? There's also another concept that the primary user might cause interference to the secondary user, but the secondary user should not at any time cause interference to the primary user, right? So on these tables that we have on your screen here, you will see some services in uppercase, and you'll see some services in mostly lowercase. That's a visual indicator as to whether that service is primary or secondary on the particular frequency band or the particular piece of the spectrum, right? So we will notice here on the bottom left, this is the amateur 2-meter band, 144 to 146 and also 146 to 148. If you notice, we have amateur, the word amateur in uppercase or capital letters. What that means, what does it mean? Think about it, we just said it. If you were to say that it means that the amateur radio operator or the amateur service is primary in this band, you would be quite correct. So again, 144 to 146, amateur is primary. 146 to 148 megahertz, amateur is also primary. But look at this here. That's the 2-meter band we were looking at. But when we come to the 70 centimeter band, so if we were to look at 430 to 432, we might see that the amateur operator is secondary, right? That's amazing, isn't it? Right? We can use it, but there are others that are primary, so we have to give way. Now, they may not use it, and therefore we think, well, we pretty much can use it all of the time, yeah, as long as they are not. But we need to know that in some bands, amateur radio operators are primary, and in other bands, we are secondary. And we have an exam question there in relation to that. It is when US amateurs are restricted in segments of bands where the amateur radio service is secondary, US amateurs may find non-amateur stations in those segments and must avoid interfering with them. So that's just saying what we talked about in a different way. It is saying that amateur radio operators can be secondary on a band. And if you are secondary and you turn your radio, tune your dial, you tune your frequency, your VFO, you punch in a frequency where you are secondary, you may hear somebody else and they may not be using amateur radio call signs. And you say, hey, what are you there? Why are you there? And you have to quickly remember that you are secondary, they are primary, and you need to give way. And you cannot, should not, must not avoid, or you must avoid interfering with them. You must not interfere with them. You are secondary, so you cannot interfere with them. They could interfere with you in a way, right? You have to give way, give them priority. Once they're there, using it. If they're not using it, by all means you can. But if you're secondary, know your place as an amateur radio operator, please. Yeah? All right. So, as a technician class operator, we have some limitations. So we have this frequency chart here, the band plan on your screen. Almost sure you cannot read it. I cannot read it. But we have zoomed in to some sections of this band plan, right? And we have highlighted using some red boxes some of the sections of the band plan, because we are talking about the technician class licensee or technician class operator. And we want to illustrate that as a technician class operator or technician class amateur radio operator, you do have some power limits that had you had a different class of license, such as a general class or extra class, you would not have those restrictions in power limits, right? But as a technician class operator, you need to be aware of your power limits. You cannot use the same amount of power in some of the bands as the general and extra class. So remember we said that once you see T means technician. So if we were to look at the 80 meter band, we will see that the technician has access to it. But we will also go down here and see T. And we'll see that the technician in the 80 meter band can only do CW, right? That's what the symbol here means. And can only use 200 watts. So that's why we kind of try to dissect this up a little bit, point you in the right direction, because the bullet points will talk about it, but where do you go on the band plan to see it? And we have tried to highlight it, bring it out, make it real for every one of us so we can see it is true. A technician, which is T, and by the way, N is a novice, yeah? So both of them can only do CW mode on 80 meters, but they are limited to 200 watts of peak envelope power, which is PEP, right? On the 40 meter band, you will see a similar occurrence. You'll have the technician class operator and can only run 200 watts or use 200 watts, yes. On the 15 meter band, you will see a similar thing where the technician class operator can only do CW or Morse code and is limited to 200 watts. That limitation applies only to the technician and also the novice, but not to the general class or extra class operator. All right. All right. Where you have a limitation of 200 watts, that's what you have. But if you have privileges on any other band, you are allowed 1.5 kilowatts. And we have just sort of tried to extract it from the rules as well as the band plan so you can see where we get all of that information from. Okay. So this is the exam question. Except for some specific restrictions, the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz is 1500 watts, and in the HF band segment is 200 watts. So what that says is what we just discussed. Their HF band segments which is 80 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters, they are limited to 200 watts. But if they're doing above 30 megahertz, so what is above 30 megahertz? Above HF, not HF. So VHF, UHF. So that's again where this trusty diagram comes in. So within the HF part of the spectrum, the bands that they do have privileges, you can only do 200 watts. Where you can do VHF and above, you can do, be our guest, use 1500 watts. You're entitled to it. So that's an exam question. Let's move on. All right, so we come to some licensing topics. So first of all, we should already be aware, because we discussed it in the intro section, that there are 3 classes of licenses that you can sit exams for today. There are other classes, you would have come across them. We would have talked about them. We would have talked about the novice class. We would have talked about the advanced class. But those are no longer available to be examined. So they're what we call grandfathered classes. The classes that we have now available to be examined and be licensed for are the technician, the general, and the extra, also properly called the amateur extra. And we have a little bit of information here, the difference between technician, general, extra. You can read that on your own. But for the exam, we need to know that there are 3 levels: technician, general, and amateur extra. We also need to know that now, once we become licensed in the US, we will get a license that is valid for 10 years. So a 10-year license is what you get. So you have the technician class, the general class, and the amateur extra. So these are 2 exam questions. Sticking with licensing, you need to be aware that when you pass your exam, on the right-hand side here, we have some screenshots as to what the ULS might look like. This is where you log in to get your information about your license and to pay. Of course, website you pay for your license. You can see the license that you have, when it was issued, and so on, right? So this is just some screenshots from the website, because we'll be talking about the FCC license database, which is the website, right? All right. So a question that may occur to you is, after you've passed your exam, when can you start to operate, right? So if this is your first exam, meaning that you were not previously licensed, you're now becoming licensed, you're now getting your amateur radio license, so you just passed the exam, you're getting your first call sign, you have to wait until your information appears online, which is the FCC license database. So once you log on and you're seeing that you appear, it's the first time that you're getting a license, as long as your what you call the station license grant, or the operator station license grant, appears on the database, meaning it appears online, you can then start to use it. You can start to transmit and talk and all those sorts of things, right? But not before. And that's the first bullet point. After passing the examination for your first amateur radio license, you may transmit on the amateur radio bands as soon as your operator station license grant appears in the FCC license database, such as this, meaning it appears online, not before. It will be an offense. It will be illegal to transmit if you have not yet been granted. I mean, the other thing too is, how will you know what call sign you got, right? So you have to wait until you get your call sign, right? And once it appears there, that's it. Because if you're not licensed and you haven't gotten onto the database yet, what call sign are you going to use? All right, okay. Also, we need to be aware that we can only have one call sign. Only one operator primary station license grant may be held by any one person. So you cannot have 2 call signs, right? Or individual call signs. Okay. Now you may say, what proof do we have that your license was granted? Well, as long as you go online and you see it there, that's the proof. So the proof that the FCC has issued an operator/primary license grant is that the license appears in the FCC ULS database, right? So once you appear here, that means that's proof that the FCC has granted you a license. All right. Now, you might be wondering, so this is actually a screenshot of my US call sign, and you might be wondering, why does it say vanity license? So all a vanity license is a call sign that you have chosen, as opposed to one that is automatically issued to you. So when, of course, you become first license, an automatic call sign will be issued to you. But some of us, like to choose letters for our call sign. So November Zulu 4 Romeo Golf. So Romeo Golf, those are my initials. So November Zulu 4 Romeo Golf is a call sign I would have chosen. And that's why they call it a vanity license, meaning that you can select a call sign. You can apply for it, and it's called a vanity license as opposed to an automatically assigned license. And that's an exam question. Any licensed amateur may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign rules. So yeah, once you get your call sign, you can choose a vanity. If it's already taken, you can't get it, but you can choose one. And if it's not already taken, or it has expired for the other user who had it before, you can be granted that as a vanity call sign. Couple more slides, folks. So in respect of licensing, you may start to notice a pattern with people who operate in different classes. Their call signs might start to paint a picture to you. You will find that persons who are holding technician class licenses tend to have longer call signs. Matter of fact, when you get issued a call sign, you will get what you call a 2x3 call sign. And what a 2x3 call sign is, you have 2 letters of a prefix, 1 digit, and 3 letters as a suffix. So this is an example here. Kilo Foxtrot 1, X-ray, X-ray, X-ray. 2 letters prefix, 1 number in the middle there, and 3 letters suffix. So that is a call sign in the US for a technician class operator. The pattern looks like this, the automatically generated one. Then you can always go and say, I want a vanity call sign, and shrink it down to maybe a 1x3 as well. But we need to know for the exam that this call sign, which is a 2x3 call sign, 2 letters, 1 digit, and 3 letters, is a valid technician class call sign format. So that's what you need to know for the exam. Kilo Foxtrot 1, X-ray, X-ray, X-ray. Notice how long it is. It's a 2x3 format. So once you have gotten your license and you neglect it, or you forget, or, somehow or the other, you just don't pay attention to realize that a license has an expiry. We did see in a previous slide that the amateur radio license granted by the FCC is for 10 years. But what happens if that 10 years has elapsed and you have forgotten to renew? Right? Well, there is a grace period after which you'll have to redo the exam. But for up to 2 years after, you don't have to redo the exam. You can just simply go and reinstate your license. Right? Of course, you'll have to pay the fee. That grace period you need to know for the exam is 2 years. So the grace period for renewal, if an amateur license expires, is 2 years. Right? You don't immediately have to redo the exam. You have up to 2 years. Now, if you let that 2 years elapse, guess what? You have to go and redo the people exam. All right. Also, just note that if your license has expired, even though you have this 2-year grace period, that 2 years is just so you don't have to redo the exam and you could renew, But you cannot operate. You cannot transmit when your license has expired. This 2-year grace period is not 2 years you could transmit without renewing, It is just 2 years that you could still renew without having to redo the exam. But if your license has expired, but it is still within the grace period, you may not continue to transmit on the amateur bands. And you must wait until the license has renewed. So people will say, hey, my license expired, but I have a 2-year grace period. But you cannot operate, right? That will be illegal. All right. So you have been warned and you have hopefully been educated. We all should bear that in mind. All right. So a club station license is something that if you have an amateur radio club, they may choose to get a club call or club station license. Right? That license is for the club. Now, when you get that club station license, that is a separate call sign to your personal or the individual call signs. So many clubs or many amateur radio clubs opt for getting a club station license. But we need to know that there's a condition for a club station license. That is, that amateur radio club must have at least 4 members to be able to be granted a club station license. And that's the next bullet point. A requirement for the issuance of a club station license grant is that the club must have at least 4 members. Exam question. Let's continue. Couple more slides. Again, sticking with licensing. So when you do the exam, you will have to provide a valid email address. So this is an exam question. If the FCC is unable to reach you by email, revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license may occur. So please maintain an email address and please use that for your communication with the FCC. Because if they try to send you an email and it bounces or it's full or it doesn't work, and maybe they try it again, they may say, all right, that person doesn't exist anymore, is not interested anymore. And they may revoke your station license or they may suspend your operator license. So maintain a good working email address, which is required for your license. So this second bullet point is just restating the same point in a different way. It says that failure to provide and maintain a correct email address with the FCC can result in revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license. Just another way to say the first bullet point. But these two are exam questions. So when we as amateur radio operators go on a ship on a vessel and we have the permission of a captain to operate on their vessel, so maybe have a wire antenna going from the mast all the way down, and we have our transmitter or transceiver on board and we're operating as an amateur radio operator, we are operating what is called maritime mobile, right? So yes, we can operate on a ship. Now we usually do have to get the permission of the captain. And if you're in international waters and you have your US call sign, you can legitimately transmit if you're in international waters, right? So that's the last bullet point. An FCC licensed amateur station may transmit from any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. So you must be documented or registered in the United States. Yeah? Need to learn that for the exam. Okay. So there are some do's and don'ts, right? There are things that we should not do. So indecent language or obscene language is not prohibited. And that's the first bullet point. There are restrictions concerning transmissions of language that may be considered indecent or obscene. And as such, that language is prohibited. So please do not cuss and carry on, right? Be cordial at all times. This is an offense. You cannot use obscene language. No, no, no. Also, we need to learn for the exam that there's only one condition in which an amateur station is authorized to transmit music. So you cannot go and play back music on amateur radio generally. But there's one bit of an exception, and that is when it is incidental to authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. So the ISS, for example, they are transmitting to you, and in the background they have some music playing, and it's incidental to the communication. That is permitted. That's it. But you cannot go and broadcast music on the amateur radio bands, put your microphone to radio on playback or something like that. No, cannot do that, right? That's prohibited. No music. Now, generally in amateur radio, you're not permitted to obfuscate or to encrypt or to have your transmissions in a way that no one can understand what you're doing. You cannot code it in such a way that no one knows what you're saying or no one knows what you're transmitting. You're not permitted to encode or obscure amateur radio messages, whether it's voice or data, except when you're using amateur radio to control or send commands to spacecraft or control what we call radio control craft. So We have a little drone there. So let's think of that as a radio controlled craft. We have a radio, maybe console device in our hand that is wirelessly sending commands. Similarly, space station like this, CubeSat maybe, we want to send it information, commands, maybe to open up a solar panel, increase the power output, change frequency. Those command and control, those commands that you send using amateur radio, you are permitted to encode or encrypt those messages, right? That's the exception, and that's the exam question. It is permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. That's the only occasion. Other than that, you cannot encode, encrypt, hide, obfuscate, obscure. You cannot do that in amateur radio legally. Right. So for the exam, we need to know that if a country objects to the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union, to amateur radio communication coming from a particular country or exchanging messages with other countries over amateur radio, that country or that territory can lodge a complaint to the ITU that they do not want their citizens, for example, to communicate with the country, so another country's citizens. That is a thing, right? So it's an exam question also. The countries with which FCC licensed amateur radio stations are prohibited from exchanging communications are any country whose administration has notified the ITU that it objects to such communication, right? We are not aware of any such country to date that have objected, right? Hopefully that stays that way. So we also need to be aware, when we had earlier identified what the amateur radio service is, we talk about non-pecuniary interest. In other words, you must not be paid for utilizing amateur radio. There's a little bit of an exception, very small exception, and we need to know that for the exam. That the control operator of an amateur radio station may only receive compensation, meaning be paid, for operating that station when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. So if you're a teacher and you're being paid, that's fine. You may use amateur radio in that instruction in that class, but you're not being paid for the amateur radio per se, right? It's just incidental to your classroom instruction as a teacher. So you're being paid to teach, or as a lecturer, or as a presenter, or as a facilitator. But you cannot be paid for the amateur radio part of it. It's incidental that you're using amateur radio, and the other thing that you're doing for gain, meaning for a salary or payment or consultancy fee payment, right? Amateur radio operators are not permitted to be paid in that way, except, of course, when it's incidental to classroom instruction at a school. Also, amateur radio operators, you can advertise equipment for sale, but not every minute, not every day. You cannot abuse it, and that's an exam question. Amateur radio operators may use their station to notify other amateur radio operators of the availability of equipment for sale or trade when they're selling their amateur radio equipment, but it must not be on a regular basis. That's what this bullet point is supposed to mean. We also need to be aware that hams should not be broadcasting, and therefore we need to understand what's the definition of the term broadcasting according to the FCC. The FCC defines broadcasting for the amateur radio service as transmissions intended for reception by the general public. So amateur radio operators are not permitted to broadcast in that way, at least not under normal times, not under normal conditions, right? Broadcasting is a circumstance in which one-way transmissions by an amateur station are prohibited. So you cannot go on broadcast using your amateur radio equipment. You cannot give a sermon and broadcast to the public. You cannot give instruction. You cannot do this to, use amateur radio for that purpose, for lecturing out that way at all. Broadcasting on the air, that is prohibited. All right, so our last slide before we go into our slide deck. So there is an occasion where you might be permitted to do something that might be considered broadcasting, right? So generally, amateurs should not broadcast. But let's talk about a little nuance and almost like a little bit of an exception. Let's read the bullet point. Amateur stations, that's you and I, may transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available. And that is when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. Those are conditions. So you can broadcast, yes, but under a very restricted series of circumstances. Not because we say, yeah, hams can broadcast, man, you know. No, you cannot make up your own emergency. It has to be where immediate safety, life is at stake, or property damage is at stake. And a news media outlet, for example, may be asking you, here, could you get that message across? We cannot, cross this river, we cannot cross the hill, or we cannot cross the street, or whatever. It's unsafe to do so, but we want to send this news item. Could you use your ham radio to do it? Well, as long as safety of human life is involved, or protection of property, yes, that is the exception. But other than that, thou shalt not broadcast. Now, we also need to be aware of one of the tenets of amateur radio. And let's get to the bullet point. This is our last slide for this evening, folks. The types of international communications that an FCC licensed amateur radio station, that's you and I, is permitted to make are communications incidental to the purposes of the amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. Notice they didn't say anything about business use here, right? Talking about amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. So a trusty slide, that we hope useful to all participants. Let's now get into our question pool review. And folks, we are on pages 102 to 114 in our no nonsense technician class license study guide. So let us quickly go to our question pool question, and then we'll look to wrap. So as before, we will speed through our questions because we've just covered all of this. We just want to see what the questions actually look like, what the right answer looks like in the context of the distractors, the wrong answers. Let's go. What operating activity involves contacting as many stations as possible during a specified period? So there are the telltale many stations as possible, specified period. We know that as contesting. Next question. Which of the following is good procedure when contacting another station in a contest? So we're talking about contesting still, but they're asking good procedure. The good procedure is to send only the minimum information needed for for proper identification and the contest exchange. Minimal. What is a grid locator, sometimes called a grid square? It's a letter number designator assigned to a geographic location. Remember, I said Trinidad and Tobago is within Foxtrot Kilo, FK. FK90 FP would be my personal grid locator, for example, right? So letter number designator assigned to a geographic location. So it's similar to what three words, if you know what that is. Which of the following methods is used to locate sources of noise interference or jamming? RDF is the answer, radio direction finding. Next question in the question pool. Which of these items will be useful in a hidden transmitter hunt? Well, we did say a directional antenna would be extremely useful. What is the Internet Radio Linking Project, or IRLP? It's a technique to connect amateur radio systems, such as repeaters, via the internet using VoIP, or Voice over Internet Protocol. But what is VoIP? What is Voice over Internet Protocol? It's a method of delivering voice communications over the internet using digital techniques. That's what VoIP in the context of amateur radio is defined as. Next question, what is required before using the Echolink system? We did say you have to register your call sign, and to do that, you have to send a copy of your license or proof of license. right? So of course, if you're a US licensee, the procedure is a lot simpler. If you're an overseas, you may actually have to scan a copy of the license and send it and so on. Yeah. Which of the following protocols enables an amateur station to transmit through a repeater without using a radio to initiate the transmission? So we said that technique or that protocol or that system or that platform that you don't have to use a radio is the Echolink platform. All right. So seeing a couple quick questions. Let's take it. Yeah, certainly you're welcome, Mark. A. Mitchell, another license for maritime operation? Yes. There are several types of licenses that you can get for maritime operation. GMDSS, you have, yes, there are licenses for maritime operation. Good question. Excellent indeed. Right. Okay. So we just talked about Echolink. How is over-the-air access to IRLP nodes accomplished? Well, we did say to access the nodes, you have to use your radio, press the push to talk, and you have to use the keypad. That is by using DTMF signals, dual tone multi-frequency. All right, what type of signal uses pairs of audio tones? Well, it's DTMF, dual tone multi-frequency. That's DTMF. What is an amateur radio station that connects other amateur stations to the internet? So we said that is called a gateway. Continuing, which agency regulates and enforces the rules for the amateur radio service in the United States? That is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of the amateur radio service? So we did extract that out, and we said that advancing skills in the technical and communications phases of the radio art. That's why we do some technical topics, electricity, electronics, and components and circuits. That's the technical aspect of it, modulation and oscillators, all of those things, technical stuff, right? Okay, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? It's defined as an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. All right, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? Right, remember we said 50 kilometers above the Earth? Right, it's an amateur station located more than 50, that's 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. Nice. Okay, when is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? Of course, that's a trick question because the answer is at no time is willful interference permitted. All right. Which of the following entities recommends transmit receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? So we said that that person is called a volunteer frequency coordinator, and they are recognized by the local amateurs, so local radio operators. Who selects that person? Who selects a frequency coordinator? Well, we all do. Amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations, right? Okay. Next question, which frequency, right? So we come to the question about the 6 meter band, and you see the other distractor questions as to why those are wrong. Which frequency is in the 6 meter band? Well, we did say the answer was 52.525, right? Because that's between 50 and 54 megahertz. But look at the other answers, 49, just below, 28, way below, 222, way above, right? So the 6 meter band, certainly 52.525 is a frequency in the 6 meter band. Which amateur band includes 146.52? Right, so again, we showed a trusty way to do it. You divide, take 300 and divide it by that number, and you'll come up with some number that will be close to 2. It wouldn't be 70, it wouldn't be 20, it wouldn't be 6, right? So that's a 2 meter band. On which HF band does a technician class operator have phone privileges? So that's why we did that slide to show you that technicians have HF privileges to speak or phone only on the 10 meter band. Again, which of the following frequency ranges are available for phone operation by technician licensees? Right? So the frequency range is the 10-meter band, which is 28.300 to 28.500. Okay, so you have to try and learn these. All right. Where may SSB phone be used in amateur bands above 50 megahertz? Well, pretty much in some segments of all of the bands above 50 megahertz, right? Okay. Which of the following VHF, UHF band segments are limited to CW only? So we gave those two. We looked at the band plan and we found it was between 50.0 megahertz and 15.1 megahertz, as well as the other segment is the 144.0 to the 144.1 megahertz band segment. Could only do Morse code or CW there, right? Or should. All right, so folks, this next question, for some reason or other, the author made a typo. So we have just shown what the correct question here from the question pool is. What is the limitation for emissions on the frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz? And we did that just a short while ago, is that fixed digital message forwarding systems only. That's the only type of emission that you're allowed as a ham between 219 and 220. Fixed digital message forwarding systems only. All right, thank you for the assist. All right, next question up. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband? And I can see all participants say, yeah, that's because I don't want to go out of frequency. You could have frequency drift. Calibration could be poor, and those are the answers there. And all of the choices are correct because it's to allow for calibration error in the transmitted frequency display. It's also so that modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge, yeah? And last but not least, to allow for transmitter frequency drift. All of those things are the reason why you do not want to punch in that band edge frequency. You want to go a little above or a little below. How are US amateurs restricted in segments of bands where the amateur radio service is secondary? Well, we are restricted. US amateurs may find non-amateur stations in those segments, and we must avoid interfering with them. Yeah, they are primary. We are secondary. All right, except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequency above 30 megahertz? Well, we show that you can do 1500 watts. Right, that's your maximum PEP, maximum peak envelope power, but above 30 megahertz. That's what? Yes, you're quite right. VHF, UHF, and so on, right? Frequencies below 30 would be HF, right? So as a technician, VHF and above, you could do 1.5 kilowatts, 1500 watts. Next up, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators in their HF band segments? Remember, they only have a few segments, and we showed graphically during the slide that it's 200 watts in those segments of the bands. All right, next question. For which license class are new licenses currently available from the FCC? So remember, we said the advanced class, the novice class are no longer available, but the technician, which is what we're doing now, the general, which is what we'll start in a couple of weeks' time, and the amateur extra, which we may run probably, that might take us well to the end of the year or very early next year, right? Those are the three classes of licenses available for sitting the exam and becoming licensed. What is the normal term for an FCC issued amateur radio license? We said it's 10 years. How soon after you pass the exam for your first amateur radio license may you transmit on amateur radio band? So don't rush the brush, don't go too fast, don't jump the gun. You can only do it as soon as your operator station license grant appears on the FCC license database. In other words, the website. Don't be too hurry. Okay, how many operator primary station license grants may be held by one person? It's only one, folks. All right, what proves that the FCC has issued an operator primary license grant? Well, what proves that is if you go online and you check the FCC ULS database, you will see the license there. That's what proves that it has been granted. Yeah? Excellent question. We must learn that. Right? Check the website. Okay. Who may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign rules? Well, any one of us, once we become licensed, we are eligible to select a vanity call sign once it's available. So any licensed amateur. All right, so remember we talked about the 2x3 format for technician class licensees when they just become licensed? Well, here's the question related to that. Which of the following is a valid technician class call sign format? So we had given that example, Kilo Foxtrot 1, X-ray. That's a valid technician class call sign. So the others are not, right? Okay. Next one. What is the grace period for the renewal if an amateur license expires? So that grace period, 2 years. So please try not to let your license expire. All right. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, may you continue to transmit on the amateur radio bands? No. You cannot. Your license has expired. The grace period is just so that you could go and get your license back without having to redo the exam. That's what the grace period is. Not that you could continue to use it, right? So the answer is no. You must wait until the license has been renewed. Don't jump the gun. All right. Which of the following is a requirement for the issuance of a club station license grant? So let's dissect that. What are they asking us? Which of the following is a requirement for what? The issuance of a club station license. That's what you want to get, right? So you have some hams, they've got together, say, hey, let's put up a repeater or something like that, right? And we may want a club call to operate that repeater. So they apply for a club station license. But to do so, the club must have at least how many members? Is it 5? Is it 3? Is it 8? Is it 10? Is it 2? No, it's 4 members to be able to apply for a club station. What may happen if the FCC is unable to reach you by email? You send me an email and it bounces. Well, you're at risk of revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license. So please maintain a valid email address. Try to make sure it's not always filled. I mean, we still have a couple of students every now and again, folks. I mean, your mailbox is full and it doesn't accept the email with the updates, right? So please try to keep it as open as possible, because with the FCC, they don't play. So you don't want an undeliverable email situation. Which of the following can result in revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license? Well, same point as above, failure to provide and maintain a correct email address with the FCC. So you see how important having an email is? It's in 2 questions. Okay. Right, so we're coming to the end, folks, of the question pool review. From which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur station transmit? All right. Well, on the sea, from any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. So what that means is you have a vessel, a fishing, you have a craft, a pleasure craft. It must be duly registered with the local authority in the United States. Okay. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmissions of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? Right, so remember we said don't cuss and carry on. Use very decent language. Let's be cordial. Let's be respectful. Right, so any such language is prohibited. Indecent language or obscene language, prohibited. All right. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using a phone emission? Well, there's only one possible good reason, and that is when it is incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. So that's the only condition under which you may have some music accompanying your transmission. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? Only when you're attempting to control space stations or radio control crafts, right? So only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. Next question in the question pool. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? We had said it's any country whose administration has been or has notified the ITU, that's the International Telecommunications Union, that it objects to such communications, right? All right. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur radio station receive compensation for operating that station? Only when that communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational instruction. Other than that, I say again, at an educational institution. Other than that, you are not permitted to receive compensation. When may amateur radio operators use their station to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? Well, yes, you can sell the radio equipment. That's when selling amateur radio equipment, and not on a regular basis, please. Not every minute you come up on the air and every day you're selling something, and for the next hour you're advertising in like QVS or one of those channels. No, you don't. That's a business then, right? So occasionally it's allowed. How does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service? It's defined as transmissions intended for reception by the general public. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? Right? Well, broadcasting, that's prohibited. When may amateur stations transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming that no other means is available? Well, when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. All right, next up. What types of international communications are an FCC licensed amateur radio station permitted to make? Well, it must be only communications incidental to the purposes of the amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. So it cannot be for business. Yeah. So folks, I think we have come to the end of our question pool review. So we just have a couple of brief announcements. So let's just go right back to our slide deck. All right. So we have been going through the question pool review, pages 102 to 114 of the No Nonsense Guide, if you have been following along. So as usual, please feel free to contact us via the email or via WhatsApp. We do try our best to answer questions. So if you have submitted a question and we have not answered, now is a good time to consider sending an email or WhatsApp. Just let me know, hey, Robbie, you missed a question I asked last week or a month ago. Please forgive me for that. We do apologize. But if it's still a burning question that you want to have answered, please try us again. Send us that email or that WhatsApp with your question, and we will try our best to deal with it. Okay, so for participants in Trinidad and Tobago, in-person exam, Saturday, 19th of August, 10 a.m., and it's going to be at the Telecom Authority of TNT. That's in Barataria. Please note that there's a deadline to register, which is the Monday before, the 14th of August. That's the deadline to submit the registration form. Registration form is at the bottom of your screen. You'll get the slide deck. You don't have to try and type this out now. You'll get the slide deck, and you can simply click on it from the slide deck. But please follow all instructions in that registration form. Things like making sure that you have your FRN before you go into the exam. Please pay attention to the instruction. There are not many instructions. Pay attention. You do not want to have disappointment on the day of the exam because you didn't follow those instructions. All right. Our next session is scheduled for next week, Friday, 28th of July, usual time, 8:30. And folks, that should be our last session for the course. All right. So thank you so much for staying the course. We do appreciate it, everyone. Really, really great participation. I think this is the largest class we have had in the couple of years we've been running this class. Thank you so much. Love the questions that are being asked, and also for the participation by all. So folks, want to wish you all the best. Do have a good night and be safe. Take good care. See you in the next session.